Good day to you. This is March 29th, still Holy Thursday, Holy Week here, and we are looking at John chapter 4. In preparation for this particular talk, I revisited this past week a lot of the research that I've done now. I realized going all the way back to the earliest time of my Bible study back in the late 1970s when I first became interested in Samaritanism, Samaritans and Samaritanism. And I will be in the OP, in the post, I will include a bibliography of studies that I've read. I want to tell you a little bit of a story about this, and then we'll talk about the woman in Samaria. Hi, Johnny. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me here today. So first, I have to, and it really is essential here, I have to say something to you that's not going to be pleasant or anything else, but basically you've been fed a line of BS, lies, and mythology about the Samaritans. And because of that, a text like John 4, when you come to it, it's not going to make a whole lot of sense. Not only is it difficult enough to try and understand halakhic issues in Judaism, that is, issues related to the kinds of rules and regulation that one orients one's life to, that so one's life is pleasing to God. And it's difficult enough there because there's so many debates and discussions, particularly around purity issues, issues related to the temple and sacrifice. If you want evidence for that, just go read the Mishnah. It's a Jewish document compiled around the end of the 2nd century by Rabbi Judah the Patriarch, and it includes some traditions that even come back as early as the New Testament. Some, not. I mean, you have to be careful how you read those texts too. But at any rate, go read the Mishnah. You'll see this back and forth of these halakhic debates that are occurring within Judaism, and they occur within the New Testament. We certainly see them occurring at Antioch. Antioch is a big halakhic debate about whether, Christian Jews can eat with Christian Gentiles, or is the meal kosher? Will they be rendered unclean? And we all know the importance of that battle. There's also something that occurs in the very same year that this occurs in 48, in the where Peter and Paul have the confrontation because the men from James come. In Judaism, it had been decreed that in 48, the Jews could not marry Samaritans anymore. The Samaritans were to be treated as Gentiles, even though they were Jews. And we're going to see that what had happened was there's this ethnic/religious mythology that gets laid on the Samaritans by the Southerners, by the Judeans. And there's an important figure that buys into that, and Christians have bought into it since. And as a result, we really have been sold a bill of goods when it comes to Samaritan. The bill of goods is, it goes like this. By the way, I have 4 quotes I'll be reading from Richard Pummer's book, The Samaritans. It's perhaps the most recent, phenomenally excellent introduction, very interesting, to the Samaritans. It's an Erdman's press book, 2016. But he has a book-length study on Josephus and Josephus's take on the Samaritans. But he points out, with regard to the story in 2 Kings 17, I do need to preface Pummer's quote here. 2 Kings 17 is a narrative you all are going to recognize where the writer says, okay, the Assyrians came in and they carted away the northern kingdom, and then they settled it with all kinds of foreigners, and the 10 lost tribes were lost forever, and the region was just basically pagan, and then eventually you had some Yahweh worshippers get converted or something, but they weren't really Jews, and you have all of that myth going on in 2 Kings 17. An important thing about 2 Kings 17 to recognize is that when Old Testament scholars read this text, they already recognize. You can see the mythological tracing happening because this is a redacted text. You can see that the writers can't fit the tradition quite accurately in with where they want it to really go. And that again is the importance of revelation within history. It's breaking apart that. But Josephus bought into a particular reading here. In the case of 2 Kings 17, 24 to 41, and this is Reinhard Pummer, Josephus is the first to read the later conflicts between Jews and Samaritans into the biblical account of the events following the return from the Babylonian exile in the late 6th century BCE in his version of events narrated in 1st Esdras and Ezra Nehemiah. Josephus is followed by so many at this point, and the assumption that remember, Josephus is a Pharisee, and if there's one group that the Samaritans, let's just say, hated, it's the Pharisees. They were not exactly well liked by the Essenes either. Okay, we know Jesus had his trouble with them. We know that Paul was one, but the Samaritans. They are not half-breeds. They are not a mixed people. You can look at the bibliography, read the books in the bibliography. What they're all basically going to tell you is this: yes, there would have been a deportation in the 8th century BCE. Yes, it would have been of the same kind of deportation you find elsewhere of the well-to-do, the money. You bring in the money and the literate, and you're leaving the people of the land behind. But there's an entire priestly tradition that gets left behind at this point. Remember, we're not dealing necessarily with literate cultures. It's not to say there isn't literature yet. It's just emerging. It's just beginning to come to the surface in the. It's still a lot of oral tradition in the Israelite nation, the 12 tribes at this point. What you have rather is this northern tradition carrying on, this theological tradition, this first kind of quote first temple. Or even pre-First Temple kind of thinking carrying on in the Samaritan priestly tradition. And that means the Samaritans are fully Jews. They're not Gentiles. But because of Josephus's reading, and because of the way Samaritans have been treated by Jews and Christians, even today, an Orthodox Jew considers a Samaritan as a Gentile. If Neusner and others are correct, that the Pharisees would have been the originary group out of which later rabbinism developed, I'm not sure of that. I still think I appreciate Phillips Seigel's thesis that there is a proto-rabbinic movement already prior to Jesus for at least 100 years. But nevertheless, if Neusner is right, and the Pharisees are in fact behind some of these traditions in the Mishnah, one of them is that Samaritan women are meant to be considered menstruants from the cradle. That is, they're literally perpetually unclean. Perpetually unclean. You can't touch them if you're a Jew. You can't go near them. That's a piece of halakha. The other thing to observe is that when you do see the Samaritans mentioned in the post-70 CE rabbinic literature, it's almost always related to these halakhic type issues, but surrounding it is this massive myth that we're dealing with, persons that are not authentically Jewish. They don't belong to the people. They are not at all to be considered the northern tribes. I don't know who's putting sad, mad faces up. That's pretty funny to see those things go. No idea about that. At any rate, so Josephus reads this narrative this way, and we've kind of bought this thing hook, line, and sinker. What Pummer says next is perhaps worth narrating. He says, during the Persian period, there's absolute evidence that we are dealing with Yahwists in what is we would call Samaria, the northern territory there. We're dealing absolutely with Yahwists. And the Sumerian, and this is now I'm quoting Pummer again, the Sumerian and Samaritan. Now there's two difference. There's a difference in terminology because Sumerians are people that live in the land. Samaritans would be part of a religious orientation. Sumerian and Samaritan onomastica from the Persian and Hellenistic times also show that there was no difference between them and the Jewish onomastica. That is, the archaeological evidence is identical. We're looking at here. And finally, he says, as is well known, 2 Kings 17 is a composite passage containing commentaries from different periods. The notion of an empty Sumerian land has been recognized to be myth. That is, the archaeology completely contradicts the 2 Kings 17 narrative. One of the fascinating things to me was to discover that the Sumerians, remember, we don't want to use the word Samaritan yet, because whether they're a religious sect or whether they're just still identified as Sumerians as that's their I'm losing words here, not their country name, but where they're from, their place of origin. What we want to recognize is that these, from the archaeology, that these folks were wealthy. They did well, okay? And there's a whole period for several hundred years where they're building their own temple. It costs money to build a temple, and they're building their temple on Mount Gerizim, while the returnees from Babylon are trying to build their temple in Jerusalem. Now, to give you an idea of just how important this was, think about it this way. There are three things that all go together: temple, power, and money. Now, you have a temple in Jerusalem, and you got all the returnees from Babylon, the Ezra-Nehemiah tradition going, this is where God wants us to have the temple. This is where David wanted the temple built. This is where Solomon built the temple. This is Mount Zion. This is where we got to do all this stuff. God wants us to do it here. And, of course, their whole textual tradition is going to reflect that, because they're changing the text all the time as they're copying it and passing it on to make sure everybody knows that's where God wants it. That's what they're certainly going to be accusing the Samaritans of, is changing the text, because the Samaritan Pentateuch is different than the Judean Judist Pentateuch. But it may well be that originally the Pentateuch said Mount Gerizim. And, of course, the Judaites have changed that to Mount Zion. At any rate, you have this wealthy people building a temple, so much so that when the Jews in Egypt want to build their temple at Elephantine, not the Jews in Egypt, when the Jews want to build their temple at Elephantine, they send letters to both the temple in Jerusalem and the temple on Mount Gerizim, seeking permission to do so. That's how much authority and esteem, the Samaritan temple was held in. So you have these two communities vying for power, and what will eventually happen is after the Maccabean revolt, a few generations down the road, one of the grandsons of the Maccabees, John Hyrcanus, in 128, will take an army from the south and just go wipe out the temple on Mount Gerizim. And that didn't start the animosity, and it didn't create such animosity that there was no intercourse between Jews and Samaritans after that. But it was a nasty, nasty, nasty event that was certainly remembered deep in the history of the Samaritan people for a long, long time. And Hyrcanus only does this to cement his own political, religious, and economic power in Judea. And so they're marginalized and persecuted. And when Pompey comes in 64, 63, and conquers Palestine, he takes the Samaritans out from underneath Hasmonean or Maccabean rule, and they love it. To them, the Romans were liberators. To the Samaritans, you see. So it's not all bad news here. We've got to stop looking at Second Temple Judaism through these kind of neo-Marxist, neoliberal, neo-progressive, revisionist history bullshit stuff. We just got to start dealing with history as history, data as data, and stop all the nonsense. At any rate, there is an interesting tidbit here with Herod the Great. He will marry a Samaritan. Is this perhaps an attempt to bring the two peoples together? And as we noted, that will fail because certainly by the middle of the 1st century CE, that is around the time of the break between Paul and the Jerusalem church at Antioch, Judaism was already beginning to separate itself from Samaritanism. Now, Samaritans have their own kind of thinking, just like the Essenes have their own kind of thinking, just like Pharisees have their own kind of thinking, just like Zadokites have their own kind of thinking, just like apocalyptic groups have their own kind of thinking, just like proto-rabbis have their own kind of thinking. There's all these ways of conceiving things in ancient Judaisms, okay? There is not such a thing as Judaism. There is no such thing as a direct line from the Second Temple priesthood all the way back to Ezra, Nehemiah, all the way back to the exile, back before that, back to Solomon, David. No, that's a myth. It's a total myth. The Ezra, Nehemiah tradition is an empire tradition. You have to understand that. Judaism doesn't exist prior to the exile. It is Judaism that comes to the land from the exile. What we know is Judaism, learned Judaism. So much so that 1,000 years later, you have two Talmuds. One is Talmud, the Palestinian Talmud, but the other is the Babylonian Talmud. There's still, and has always been a strong was until recently, a strong Jewish community in that part of the world. So when we come to the Gospel of John, we have to understand that the Judeans viewed Galileans suspiciously to begin with. Galilee was perceived as a hotbed of revolutionary activity. The Judeans certainly viewed the Samaritans with great suspicion. They would not have been allowed in the temple in Jerusalem, for example. Another thing about Samaritanism and Samaritans you need to know is, and I didn't want to rush into John 4 without giving some of this background. First of all, like the Judeans, they would also have synagogues, which is an important piece to note, because if your so-called enemy does something, you don't just copy them. This emerges out of this larger Jewish tradition, so they have synagogues. And another important thing to know about Samaritans and Samaritanism is that in the 1st century, there's some particular figures that will arise within Samaritanism that are going to have quite an influence. One we know from the book of Acts, Simon Magus. The other is Josephus. And Josephus is a Samaritan teacher. And I found it, again, I'm going to cite Pummer here. There are 3 things. Now, just consider the Gospel of John in your head here, okay, just for a moment. There are 3 things that you can say about Josephus. I'll just simply read what Pummer says, and then we'll note the 3 things. Josephus had the reputation of being able to work miracles, that's number 1, and to have written down his ideas. So he's literate. That's 2. He also appears to have applied Deuteronomy 18:15 to himself. That is, he saw himself as the prophet like Moses, whose return was expected by his disciples. So there's some people going to jump on this and go, see, the Jesus myth is made on the Josephus myth. No, they're missing the point here. With Josephus, what you have in the 1st century is a figure like Jesus, but a figure like this woman has either known, or if Josephus is the suggestion is he's doing his work in the early part of the 1st century CE. In other words, the same time Jesus is doing his. We know of other miracle workers in Jesus' time: Honias the water drawer, or Honi the water drawer, Onias, and others that are other ecstatics that are doing these kinds of signs and different things. Magic is not unknown in the ancient world. Both Jews and Samaritans wore amulets. In the last 20, 30 years, there's been a lot of research done on superstition and folklore in Second Temple Judaism, and how you have all the prohibitions against stuff, but people, just because there's a prohibition doesn't mean people don't do it, so it's, sign says 55 on the freeway, people still do 65. And there's a lot of this stuff been discovered archaeologically, and it's fascinating to see the amount of superstition that goes along with some of what I would consider to be the rather extreme and bizarre apocalyptic visions and these kinds of things. But let's now come to the text of John. Jesus is going to travel through Samaria. It's not altogether safe to do that. It depends on the orientation of the particular Samaritans that he's passing. There are going to be some Samaritans, as is recorded in Josephus, that would occasionally kill Galilean peasants traveling through the territory. It's kind of like you're in our hood now, and you don't belong here, and you're dead. That's the way it is. It certainly happens to Samaritan pilgrims in Judean countryside, in Judean territory, same kind of thing. Doesn't mean it happens all the time or that it's regular, but it does happen enough that people get suspicious. And so here's Jesus, and he's traveling down through Samaria, and he comes to Sychar, near a plot of ground where Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Wow, bang. Now you're right in the middle of Samaritan theology, because it's the Samaritans who first propagated the traditions of the patriarchs. That is, it's the northern kingdom that will pass on the traditions of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Isaac is sacrificed, according to Samaritan tradition, on Mount Gerizim. That's Mount Moriah. Okay, it's a holy place. It's a sacred place. So you have immediately this patriarchal tradition, which is so essential to Samaritan thinking, sets it right up. This is an author that knows Samaritans, understands their thinking, understands their way of existing. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey. That's lovely. You have to hand it to this writer who, writing some 60 years after the fact from memory, adds these lovely little details that some will say it indicates Jesus' humanity, but it just certainly gives a narrative reason why he's going to sit down by the well, and it's about the 6th hour, and here's Jesus' problem. He doesn't have anything to drink with. So a Samaritan woman comes to the water, to the well to draw water. We know it's about noon. It's the heat of the day. It's not exactly water drawing time. So we're also given a signal that this woman is of questionable character, or certainly someone to be avoided. She comes out by herself, where she won't be shamed. And Jesus says, "Will you give me a drink?" He asks her for a drink. And in good Semitic fashion, the request will be honored. It's hospitality. The writer notes in a little footnote, his disciples had gone into town to buy food. Remember the purse Judas carries? We've talked about. I may have done that in another talk in my mentoring group. I'm sorry. At any rate, the disciples are gone. Jesus is by himself. He's hanging out at the well. The Samaritan woman says, "You're a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" And the writer says, "For Jews do not associate, have things in common with Samaritans." Now, by the time the writer writes this, there's already been that breach in 48 where Jews and Samaritans can't marry anymore. Okay? And they're to be considered menstruants from the cradle. So imagine that this woman, now what is she doing? She's buying into the myth. You're a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman. She's buying into the myth. What are you doing talking to me? I don't get this. You're violating every boundary. You're a Jew. I'm a Samaritan. You're a male. I'm a woman. I mean, this conversation should not be happening. This is what she's thinking in her head, and she's kind of saying out loud here, how can you ask me for a drink? I can't put this together. This doesn't work. We're mortal enemies. We're hierarchical enemies. You know, you're a man, I'm a woman. All the stuff that goes on here. You're the oppressor, I'm the oppressed. Your people destroyed my temple. Bum, 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 bum. Jesus says, if you knew the gift of God, bam. I want you to notice, first thing he does, he doesn't get involved in a theological debate. Not yet. He just simply says, if you knew the gift of God and who it was that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him. And he would have given you the hudor zone. Another Johannine double meaning word. Zoe, life, okay? But in context with as a participle, living water or running water. It can also mean running water as well as living water. It's a double meaning word, okay? If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. Sir, the woman said, you're not a realist. You got nothing to draw water with. You're sitting here by the well. You got nothing to draw water with. You're asking me for a drink, and you're telling me that if I should be the one asking you? Is that what you're telling me? And the well's deep. How are you going to get down there? Where can you get this hudor zone? Now she knows something's happening here. She knows something's happening. But she can't put her finger on it. It's just like the disciples in chapters 1, 2, and 3 in Nicodemus, isn't it? Something's happening, but they can't put their finger on it. They just can't quite grasp it yet. And then she has to say, okay, you know, we Northern Israelite Samaritans, you know, we've got this tradition, and you know, we're heirs of this patriarchal tradition. Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well? He drank from it. He drank from it right here. See, there's the little plaque that says Jacob drank here in 1238 BCE. See the plaque? It's right there. It lets us know it's a historical marker. He drank from this well, as did his sons and their flocks and their herds. Just all this water. This well's full of water, right? But it's deep. And Jesus replies, is he greater than Jacob? Could he have said, greater than Jacob is here? Could have. Certainly says it to the crowds in the synoptics, greater than Sullivan's here, greater than Jonah's here. Could have said greater than Jacob's here. He doesn't. He's not mimetic at this point. He's not in competition with the patriarchs and all of the tradition that the Samaritans want to attach themselves to. He simply replies, everybody who drinks this water will be thirsty again. If Jacob drank this water, good, but he drank other water. He got thirsty. It didn't quench his thirst. If his sons drank this water, good, then that's fine, but it didn't quench their thirst. If the flocks and herds drank this water, good, but they thirsted again and had to drink other water. Anyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give him will never thirst. You take a sip and it's done. You're never thirsty. Indeed, the water I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to life, the life of the age. The translations read eternal life. Please don't think of some kind of evangelical scenario. It has to do with the quality of life. Now the woman replies, sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty And I have to keep coming back here to draw water. I like this idea, Jesus. I really like this, because this coming out in the heat of the day to draw water and being shamed by everybody, this ain't working for me. So how about you give me this magic water so I don't get thirsty and I can just go back to living my life and not have to worry about this public humiliation thing and being thirsty and having to come out in the heat of the day and deal with all kinds of people, including white males, or I'm sorry, including Jews. He said to her, "Go, call your husband and come back." I have no husband," she replied. Jesus said, "You're right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you've just said is quite true." She says, "I have no husband." He says, "You've had 5. The guy you would know isn't your husband, so you're right. You have no husband." "Sir," the woman says, "I can see that you're a prophet. I can see that you have these abilities that are a bit beyond normal, because you just met me out here by a well in the middle of the heat of the day when nobody's around, and you know all this stuff about me. I perceive you're a prophet. You got something going on here. Now, if that's the case, I need you to really settle a major issue for me, please. Was Pelagius or Augustine right? Was Calvin or Luther right? Who was right? Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews..." She doesn't know he's been to the temple already in chapter 2 and done his thing. "You Jews," she says, or "you Judeans." And at this point, if there is any historical character to this narrative, and I'm not sure there is, I mean, not that it didn't happen or couldn't have happened, but certainly we're dealing with this writer's elaboration of this, because she would have certainly recognized Jesus' Galilean accent, but for this writer, Jews as Judeans, again, as David Bentley Hart recognizes in his translation, "You Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." Now, first of all, she says, "You Jews claim where we must worship is in Jerusalem," but they're not allowed to worship there. But everybody's supposed to come there. Gentiles are supposed to come there in the end times, right? But Samaritans aren't allowed, and they're below Gentiles on the social ladder. If you will go look at Jeremias' Jerusalem in the time of Jesus, you'll find that out. Gentiles are at the bottom of the ladder, and bam, Samaritans are lower. They've been scapegoated by this mythology, this whole mythology that's been laid on them about their identity, okay, and where they come from, and who, and of course they know better, and they're saying, "No, we know better. That's not our identity." But she buys, as I've said twice now into this, in the early part of the narrative, you're a Jew and I'm Samaritan, what's happening here? And then she buys into it. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain. You Jews claim the place where we worship is in Jerusalem, must be in Jerusalem. I need you to solve this problem for me. Tell me, where's the right place to worship? Now, think about this for just a moment. The woman wants living water. She doesn't want to have to come back out to this well. But more than that, she's really trying to understand who she is. Do I belong here with these people? Because if you tell me I get to worship in Jerusalem, maybe I can go there and do a reboot. Maybe I can be accepted. I'm looking for some place to be accepted. And Jesus says, "Believe me, woman, a time is coming when you will worship the Father, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem." And now Jesus has done something. He has taken worship of the Father outside of the framework of sacrifice. You will worship the Father in spirit and truth. So I'm going to come back to that in a second, because there's a little more here the writer's doing. The time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. Worship is taken entirely out of the context of a number of things here. One, land. The concept of holy land, sacred place. That is, something happened here, it's holy, and we have to just stick with this, okay? There is no more important text today for those who are interested in the city of Jerusalem and the temple there and what's happening on the Temple Mount with the mosque and the wall and all the Christian monasteries and their sacred sites and everything else around there. There's no more important text than this one. God is not to be found in a particular piece of real estate. There is no sacred place or space. God is worshipped in pneuma. That's a word we've already encountered. Breath, wind, spirit, in pneuma, and in aletheia. Remember, aletheia, truth, comes through Jesus in 1:15. Chesed and emeth, grace and truth, charis and aletheia, come through Jesus. You will worship the Father in pneuma. We don't know what pneuma means yet. We translate it in spirit. Spiritual worship, and we think we know what this means. We don't know what this means. Don't import your words, your meanings into this author's words. You just confuse yourself. Just let the meaning emerge as we work through this text. We're going to worship God in pneuma and in truth. That's what he says to her. And then he says, this is funny. This again, I don't believe it's the historical Jesus. It's the writer of the gospel. He says, you Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming. Now, I have a difficulty with this because I can't quite make sense out of it in terms of the actual mythology of the text. Is the writer saying that, yes, the mythology of 2 Kings 17 is correct? Salvation comes from the Jews? It's difficult. That's a difficult text for me. Verse 22 is a very difficult text. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. I'm wondering, now this is, again, it's a wonderment, if the writer's referring to Samaritans and the influence of Samaritans. Remember, there's no such thing as Samaritanism. There are sects within Samaritanism, just as there are within the Judean area, just as there are in Galilee. There's so many different types of sects. Is he arguing against the Scythians here at this point? Is he arguing against the influence of this kind of thinking? Another very important piece of information, this is just for your general historical interest, is that in the last 30 years, it's become recognized that it is Samaritanism that is, in fact, the kind of seedbed of what will become Gnosticism, first through Samaritan influence, then through Jewish influence, and then the Gnostic literature, as you know, is very, very influenced by Jewish themes. At any rate, you have within this ethos a whole way of thinking where somebody's claiming to be the prophet like Moses, and they've written down their traditions and they've done miracles. It certainly could be that they're perceived as a rival to Jesus, in the community in which the writer's writing. If the writer's writing from Ephesus, there are Samaritan synagogues that have been unearthed in Thessalonica and on the Greek island of Delos. So it's not like there weren't Samaritan communities out in the ancient world, just as there were John the Baptist communities all over the ancient world, just as there were synagogues all over the ancient world, some influenced by Pharisees. There was certainly an Essene presence in Ephesus. So, when you think about ancient Judaism, just don't think land of Israel. Think bigger picture here. We're dealing with a lot. The Jewish community in Alexandria was almost 25% of the entire population. It's estimated that there were between 100 and 500,000 Samaritans during the time of Jesus. Probably closer to 200,000 is a figure that seems to be most folks will settle on. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of people. And considering that they're well-to-do financially, considering that they tended to be a little more friendly toward the Romans because they were delivered from Hasmonean rule and the bad Judeans who destroyed their temple. I mean, This is the Samaritans. Now, there's another piece of this Samaritan thinking you have to be aware of. There's 4 parts to the Samaritan Creed: belief in the one God, belief in Moses, belief in Torah, and belief in the day of vengeance and recompense. Those are the 4 parts. So there's a 5th later on that comes in down the road for modern Samaritans in the Middle Ages. But those are the 4 creedal beliefs. We believe in one God. Moses is his prophet. Torah is God's book. And there's a day of recompense and judgment coming. That's Samaritan thinking. Okay? And you get this day of judgment concept, don't you? The hour is coming, Jesus says, or the day is coming. My day, my hour. And there's a judgment that's coming. And so this day of judgment and recompense in Samaritan thinking, which is eschatological, is now, in this writer's view, of course, here already. The time is coming, and now is. That, of course, that's not yet in our text, but certainly the time is coming when you will worship the Abba on not this mountain or any other mountain. He continues to say, the time is coming and has now come. Now he says it. When the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. God is Pneuma, and his worshippers must worship in Pneuma and in Aletheia. Again, we don't know what these words mean. We're just starting to parse them out in terms of this gospel's thinking. And then the woman comes back, and she comes back with a Judean question. This is not her question. She says, I know that Messiah is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. Okay? Now, Samaritans don't believe in Messiah. They believe in Taheb, the prophet like Moses, from Deuteronomy 18. And I've mentioned to you before in other talks that Luke structures his travel narrative, chapters 9 through 18, around the theme of the rejected prophet like Moses, okay? So when she says there's this Messiah figure coming, she's referring to somebody from the south, somebody oriented to David's line, this kind of Pharisaic militant figure. But in reality, she's talking about Taheb, the prophet to come. She's already perceived he's a prophet. She wants to know, is he the prophet? Is he this Deuteronomy 18 prophet like Josephus claimed to be? I know that there's this Messiah that's coming, she says. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. That's her notion of Taheb. And Jesus says, I who speak to you am he. Bam. There's the self-disclosure. Now, skipping the next text where the disciples join Jesus, you move down to verse 39. The woman goes back into town, into where she lives, and she's talking to everybody. Remember, this is a woman who's shamed to come out to the well at the regular hour. Here she goes back into town, and she starts telling everybody. He told me everything I ever did. Boom, boom. There's a guy out there who knows everything about me. What is the day of recompense and vengeance about? It's when God takes everything known about you, lays it out in the columns, good and bad, and then you got to figure out how much you owe. Samaritans, interestingly, don't use the term Gehenna or hell or Hades. They simply refer to the fire. That's their eschatological term, the fire. At any rate, who is it that they're waiting to bring, for God to bring the day of vengeance and recompense upon? Certainly the Southerners, the Judeans, those who destroyed their particular temple back, 150 years previous to this conversation. That's who they're waiting for. And Jesus is trying to tell her, none of that is real. None of this theological thinking you have matters. And all that matters to her is that this day of recompense has come. And she's been offered living water. This day of judgment has come, and everything that could be known about her is known, and she's not shamed with him. He doesn't shame her. He simply speaks truth. Not just to her, but to the mythology she's bought into. Then it says, the Samaritans came out to him, and they urged him to stay with them. Now here comes the hospitality. And he stayed 2 days. He stayed 2 days. And because of his words, many more became believers. Here you have Samaritan disciples. Get this. Samaritan followers of Jesus of Nazareth. Let's come back to the break in the episode. Actually, it's 45 minutes. We'll come back to the break next time before we move on to Jesus' second journey to Jerusalem in the Gospel of John. Okay, a little bit about Samaritanism. I will be putting in the OP in just a moment when we end this. A little bibliography for those of you that really want to explore this further. I will mention a lot of your commentaries are still oriented toward the Josephus rendering of the 2 Kings fictional 17, 2 Kings 17 fictional account of the origin of the Samaritans. Do be careful of your modern commentators. There's it's really only been in the last 20 years that we've really, frankly, understood the impact and the import and the substantive influence of Samaria and Samaritanism on both Second Temple Judaism and on the New Testament as well. There are many places where the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Qumran scrolls agree together over against the Masoretic text. Okay, we're not dealing here with a marginalized group of people that are just half-breeds that don't have any authenticity to them. No, we have a lineage here that we have to deal with, but Jesus will say, even that has to be transcended. Would to heavens that those who use this text today to try to talk about Jesus and the marginalized recognize that all of the identity politics they practice cannot be justified by this text. As a matter of fact, Jesus says identity politics will be transcended, and those who worship the Father will worship in spirit and in truth. All right, man. Peace and love. Cheers. Talk to you later. Bye-bye now.